cats and dogs have long been thought of as natural enemies. Stories of them fighting, snarling and chasing one another have persisted for generations, often leaving the impression that these two animals could never coexist peacefully. But the truth is far more nuanced, and today's story proves just how wrong that stereotype can be. Despite that, there are some exceptions to this common belief, one that may surprise pet owners. Be sure to keep watching to find out where this story goes next. Meet Railan, a sweet and gentle dog who doesn't just tolerate cats, but has dedicated her life to loving and caring for them. Railan isn't an ordinary dog. She has a unique talent for playing the role of a mother to vulnerable kittens. Her owner Laura is a devoted foster caregiver for abandoned animals, and together they've changed the lives of countless kittens. One day, Laura received a call about a litter of 4 kittens found alone on the streets. These tiny creatures were barely 3 weeks old, their eyes just beginning to focus on the world. Tragically, it seemed their mother had abandoned them, leaving them to fend for themselves in a cold and unforgiving environment. With no one else to care for them, their survival hung by a thread. Laura, as always, answered the call. She brought the kittens into her home, determined to give them a second chance at life. But caring for such young kittens is no small task. They required around-the-clock attention, from bottle feeding every few hours to keeping them warm and clean. Laura was prepared for the challenge, but she also had a secret weapon: her dog, Railan. Originally, he was my foster dog, but nobody wanted him and I ended up falling in love. I quickly realised he was very gentle and loving with small animals, so I started fostering kittens instead, and the rest is history. Said Laura about Railan. Railan had been part of Laura's family for years, and during that time she'd developed a remarkable bond with kittens. She seemed to understand their fragility and need for affection, instinctively stepping in as a surrogate mother whenever a new litter arrived. With her gentle demeanour and endless patience, Railan was the perfect caregiver for the kittens that passed through Laura's home. When the 4 tiny kittens arrived, they were understandably nervous. Faced with a large, unfamiliar dog, their first instinct was to keep their distance, but Railan, ever the maternal figure, approached them with a calm and soothing presence. Slowly she began to win their trust. She would lie down near their crate, her warm eyes filled with kindness as if to say, "You're safe now." It didn't take long for the kittens to realise that Railan wasn't a threat. In fact, she was the closest thing to a mother they'd had since birth. The big dog would gently lick their tiny faces, a gesture that mimicked the grooming they would have received from their feline mother. Her warmth and soft fur provided a comforting place for them to snuggle, and soon the kittens were curling up against her belly to sleep. At first, the kittens were quite nervous of Railan, but then they quickly realised they loved when he licked them and cleaned them like a mother cat. Railan's care wasn't just practical, it was deeply emotional. Her presence seemed to bring the kittens a sense of security they had never known. They began to seek her out, following her around the house like ducklings trailing after their mother. They would climb all over her, tiny paws pressing into her fur as they explored their new world. Railan never minded. She was endlessly patient, letting the kittens use her as a living jungle gym before they finally settled down for a nap. For the kittens, Railan became the centre of their universe. They adored her, their purring a constant soundtrack to their time together. Whether it was playtime or rest, they wanted to be near her. Railan, in turn, seemed to understand their need for affection. She would nuzzle them gently, her tail wagging softly as they climbed onto her back or nestled into her side. Even the shyest of the kittens couldn't resist Railan's charm. Laura marvelled at how her dog had a way of bringing out the best in every kitten, no matter how timid they were at first. Railan's love was unconditional, and it was clear that she was as devoted to the kittens as they were to her. As the weeks passed, the kittens began to grow. Under Laura's and Railan's care, they transformed from fragile, uncertain creatures into healthy, confident young cats. They learned not only how to eat and play, but also how to love. Railan's example taught them the meaning of kindness and affection, lessons that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. When the time came for the kittens to find their forever homes, it was a bittersweet moment. Laura was thrilled to see them go to loving families, but she and Railan both felt the pang of saying goodbye. For Railan, the absence of her tiny charges was especially noticeable. She missed the pitter-patter of their little paws, their joyful purring, and the way they would snuggle against her at the end of the day. But Railan's work was far from over. Within weeks, Laura received another call about a litter of kittens in need, and once again, Railan stepped up to the task. This time, she greeted the newcomers with the confidence of a seasoned caregiver. Her heart was as open as ever, ready to pour love into the lives of these vulnerable creatures. Each time a new litter arrived, the process repeated itself. Nervous kittens would arrive, wary of their surroundings, only to be won over by Railan's warmth and kindness. The cycle of love and healing continued, with Railan serving as a mother figure to countless kittens over the years. Laura often reflects on the impact Railan has had, not just on the kittens, but on the people who adopt them. The families who welcome these kittens into their homes are always struck by their affectionate and trusting nature, a direct result of the love they receive from Railan. These kittens, once abandoned and vulnerable, now live happy, fulfilling lives in homes where they are cherished. Railan's story has touched the hearts of many. Friends, neighbours, and even strangers on social media have been inspired by her extraordinary compassion. Laura has shared photos and videos of Railan with her kittens, showing the world what unconditional love looks like. The sight of a big dog surrounded by tiny kittens, all of them content and at peace, is a powerful reminder of the bonds that can form between animals. For Laura, Railan is more than just a pet. She's a partner in her mission to rescue and care for abandoned animals. Together, they have built a legacy of love, one kitten at a time. And for Railan, each new litter is an opportunity to do what she does best: give her heart to those who need it most. The story of Railan and her kittens is a testament to the idea that love knows no boundaries. It doesn't matter that Railan is a dog and her charges are cats. What matters is the connection they share, built on trust, care, and genuine desire to nurture one another. In a world that often emphasises differences, Railan's story is a beautiful reminder of what can happen when we focus on what unites us. Her actions have shown that compassion has no limits, and her legacy will live on in the lives of the kittens she has helped. Thanks to Railan, the 4 kittens found abandoned on the street have grown into happy, healthy cats. They've been adopted into loving homes where they continue to thrive. But perhaps more importantly, they carry with them the lessons of love and kindness they learned from their surrogate mother. As for Railan, her work continues. Each new litter of kittens brings fresh challenges and joys, but one thing remains constant: her unwavering love and dedication. She has proven time and time again that the bond between animals can be as strong and pure as any human connection. Railan's story is a beacon of hope, showing that even in the face of hardship, love has the power to heal and transform. It's a story that reminds us to look beyond appearances and embrace the connections that truly matter. For Railan and the kittens she cares for, love is all that's needed to create a better world. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving us a like. Tell us what you think in the comment section. And lastly, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.